Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Today, we're looking at a major development in the Russia-Ukraine war that goes beyond the front lines. Ukraine is increasingly turning Russia's own geography, infrastructure, and economic model into pressure points, while Moscow is being forced to answer a difficult question. How much of the country can it realistically defend? The latest example is Ukraine's expanding campaign against Russian energy and transportation networks. What makes these operations significant is not just the damage from any individual strike. The larger issue is that Ukraine is challenging one of Russia's biggest strategic assumptions, that its size creates safety. For years, Russia's vast territory has been one of its greatest advantages. The logic was simple: push critical assets deep inside the country, protect them with distance, and keep the war contained near Ukraine. But that assumption is becoming much harder to maintain. This week, Ukrainian drones reached the Omsk refinery in Siberia, one of Russia's largest refining facilities, and located roughly 1,500 miles from Ukrainian-controlled territory. The significance was not simply that a refinery was damaged. It showed that Russia's traditional rear areas are no longer automatically secure, and that creates a massive defense problem for Moscow. Russia has thousands of miles of territory, energy facilities, military bases, transportation hubs, and industrial sites. Every additional target that Ukraine can threaten forces Russia to spread out its air defenses and security resources. That challenge is also playing out closer to the occupied territories, especially Crimea. Ukraine has expanded its effort to isolate Crimea by targeting the logistics network that keeps the peninsula supplied. After attacks on land routes and port infrastructure, Ukrainian forces have now focused on maritime fuel shipments. Ukrainian officials reported strikes against multiple Russian vessels carrying fuel near the Sea of Azov. Again, the important point is the strategic effect. Crimea has been one of the most important symbols of Russian control since Moscow annexed it in 2014. But maintaining Crimea requires a constant flow of fuel, supplies, and infrastructure support. Ukraine is trying to make that system more expensive and more difficult. The pressure is already showing up inside Russia's economy. Russia remains one of the world's largest energy producers, but the war is increasingly creating contradictions that are difficult for the Kremlin to manage. Fuel shortages have spread across parts of the country, forcing restrictions at some gas stations and creating transportation problems. In Bashkortostan, one of Russia's major fuel-producing regions, residents reported long lines and rationing despite the region's significant refining capacity. Farmers and transportation companies have warned about rising costs. Small businesses are feeling the effects of higher fuel prices and supply uncertainty. This is a particularly uncomfortable problem for the Kremlin, because Vladimir Putin's political brand has always been built around stability. Since the chaos of the 1990s, the promise has been that the Russian state would deliver order and predictability. The longer the war continues, the harder that message becomes to maintain when people experience very practical problems like fuel shortages, higher costs, and concerns about what comes next. And those economic pressures are arriving as Russia's broader war spending continues to climb. Russian government spending reached approximately $320 billion during the first half of 2026, consuming more than half of the planned annual budget. The federal deficit has expanded significantly, while oil and gas revenues have declined compared with the previous year. Russia received a temporary boost from higher energy prices during the Middle East conflict, but that benefit faded quickly. The larger economic picture remains one of increasing pressure from a war that requires enormous resources. That pressure is not yet translating into a willingness from Putin to compromise. Reports indicate that Putin remains focused on achieving control over the remaining Ukrainian-held areas of Donetsk and believes Russia can continue a war of attrition. Sources familiar with Kremlin thinking say he views territorial gains as necessary for any acceptable outcome. The challenge is that the strategy depends on Russia maintaining manpower, economic endurance, and political patience. Recent reporting from inside Russia suggests that manpower remains a concern. An alleged Russian general described a gap between optimistic battlefield reporting reaching senior leadership and the realities facing Russian forces. The reported assessment was that Russia would need tens of thousands of additional recruits every month to achieve its objectives, something that would be increasingly difficult without a major political decision. That brings us to one of the most important developments from the NATO summit in Ankara: the expanding defense relationship between Washington and Kyiv. President Donald Trump's decision to allow Ukraine to produce Patriot interceptor missiles under license represents a significant political signal. Patriot remains one of the few systems capable of intercepting Russian ballistic missiles, which have become a major threat to Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. The immediate impact will still depend on timelines. Advanced weapons production does not happen overnight. Ukraine needs additional interceptors now, while domestic production would provide a longer-term solution. But the strategic message is clear. Ukraine is trying to become less dependent on emergency weapons shipments and more capable of sustaining its own defense industry. That industrial competition is becoming one of the defining features of this war. Ukraine has developed significant expertise in drones and unmanned systems because it has been forced to innovate under pressure. Now, Kyiv is attempting to turn those battlefield lessons into partnerships with Western countries. At the same time, Russia and China appear to be deepening their own military technology relationship. Documents reported by The Insider describe discussions between Russian and Chinese defense organizations involving counter-Starlink capabilities, missile defense, artificial intelligence, and autonomous weapons. The reported arrangement highlights a broader competition over the future of warfare. China brings manufacturing scale, electronics, and AI development. Russia brings battlefield experience from Ukraine. Both countries see value in combining those strengths. The intelligence competition surrounding the war is also intensifying. Poland recently sentenced Russian opposition activist Igor Rogov to 7 years in prison after finding him guilty of spying for the FSB and involvement in a parcel bomb plot. Italy expelled 2 Russian military attachés following a separate espionage investigation. In the United States, a Russian national with alleged former FSB ties pleaded not guilty in a cyber espionage case involving attacks against Western organizations. Meanwhile, Russia continues announcing arrests of individuals accused of working with Ukrainian intelligence, including alleged plots involving attacks on Russian military officials and facilities. While those claims cannot be independently verified, they reflect the growing importance of covert operations alongside the conventional war. On the battlefield, the conflict remains largely attritional. Russia continues offensive operations in eastern Ukraine, but has struggled to achieve decisive breakthroughs. Ukraine, meanwhile, is increasingly focused on disrupting logistics, fuel supplies, and command networks rather than simply contesting every piece of territory. Thanks for listening. If you value clear, consistent analysis, leaving a review or a comment helps others discover the show. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, offering deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Appreciate your time. Have a great weekend ahead.